Increasing student success is at the top of the list for everyone in Des Moines Public Schools. Today we welcome education consultant Jamie Vollmer to talk about ways to gain the public support for our public schools, next on Classroom Connections. Hi, and welcome to Classroom Connections, a public affairs discussion on issues important to students, teachers, and parents in the Des Moines Public Schools. I'm your host, Sarah Taylor. Jamie Vollmer is an attorney and businessman who was a member of the Iowa Business and Education Roundtable and then served as its executive director before forming his own consulting firm nearly 20 years ago. Once a harsh critic of public education, he is now recognized as one of the leading advocates for our schools. In his recent book, Schools Cannot Do It Alone, Jamie confronts the threats to public education as well as ways to increase student success. He is here today to share some of his advice. Thanks for joining me, Jamie.
My pleasure, Sarah.
So by your own admission, you used to be a cynical critic of public schools, and now you're one of the leading advocates for public education. What made that change?
Well, I had certain assumptions, and I'll bet good money that there are businessmen and women watching this show who have the same three assumptions today. When I got into this in 1988, when I was asked to join the Iowa Business Roundtable and Education Roundtable, I was sure that the schools needed to change, that we were not getting the graduates that we needed, that the people who worked inside the school, they were the problem. They were hunkered down in a monopoly with no incentive to change, shielded from competitive forces in the marketplace. And the third assumption I had is if you would just run it like a business, everything would be okay. So in the course of this interview, I will simply say that the third assumption, running it like a business, that was dispensed with as I got more and more familiar with the schools, and in a very famous story now, I am pleased to say, called the Blueberry Story, which people can Google if they want. A teacher made it clear to me that in business you had control over the quality of the raw material, and in schools you did not. That the parents send them all, rich, small, poor, smart, all of them. And again, it's too short here to make the case, but the fact is schools are not a business. Can we graft certain practices and procedures from the private sector to the pre-K-12 culture? Yeah, doesn't make it a business. Then I began to realize, the more I spent time in schools, that in fact the people working inside our schools were not the enemy. 40 hours a week for most of them is nothing. 50 hours, 60 hours is routine. The teachers in this district, for example, they stand in front of the most diverse, distracted, demanding generation of students the world has ever seen. Many of them are victims of a pop culture that has assaulted their physiology, fractured their attention span, and given them, and not to put too fine a point on it, their parents, a dangerously overdeveloped sense of entitlement. But the fact of the matter is, everybody could work 100 hours a week, and we would not get the workers that we need, we would not get the citizens that we need, we would not get the neighbors that we need, because it's not a people problem, as I assumed, and many still do. It's a system problem. The system is broken and needs to change. So in that growth, you could say I began to move to be an advocate of the people working inside and of changing schools.
Okay, so you have coined what you call nostalgia, which is a combination of nostalgia and amnesia.
That's right.
And so how can this point of view hurt our work to improve schools, and is there a cure for it?
So there's a great question. Following from the first, let's assume for the moment that schools need to change, that there is a profound flaw in the system. They were never designed to unfold the full potential of every child. They were never designed to teach all kids to high levels. As a matter of fact, one of the most shocking moments that I had in my learning curve when I first got involved with the Roundtable was not when I was reading an educator from the late 20th century. It's when I was reading the words of Thomas Jefferson, who basically created schools in America. And Jefferson, in all of his brilliance, he unleashed the genius of tens and millions of Americans. But in his plan, he says that the purpose of the school should be, this is a quote, to rake the genius from the rubbish, close quote. So based on that blueprint, over the decades, we built this tremendous selecting and sorting system that must change. How we group kids. Why in heaven's name do we group them today according to their date of manufacture? It makes no sense. Some children show up having been read to every single night since, oh, who am I kidding? In this town, there are parents who put speakers on the mother's belly and pumped baby Einstein and Mozart into the womb. And those children show up the same day in the same classroom with a child who's never seen anybody read. We batched them according to when they're manufactured, giving very little focus on where they all are in their various levels of development. That's got to change. What we teach has to change. You'll hear people down at the coffee shop say, oh, these kids today, they're not learning what we learned. The fact of the matter is, they can't learn everything that I was taught, that my father was taught, that my grandfather was taught, and everything that's happened since in the same school calendar that we've had for decades. So what we teach, when we teach, how we teach, that's all got to change. And the reason I came up with the idea of anesthesia is that when you go to make a significant change, if the superintendent here wanted to make substantive changes to all those building blocks that I described, there's a significant number of people in the community who would say, oh, that ain't the way we do it around here. They have an idea in their heads. The social psychologists call it a mental model. They have a mental model of the way school ought to be. They have anesthesia. They think they know what it should look like, and it's the school that they went to.
So in your book, Schools Cannot Do It Alone, you dedicate the last part to what you call the Great Conversation. And tell us what that entails and how can it help build public support for public schools?
Here's the key. You could have called the Great Conversation anything. I'm not that good with names, so I just sort of called it what it needs to be. The vast majority of taxpayers in Iowa have no children in school. 85% have no children in school. Those folks, back to anesthesia, they've got an idea in their heads, not only about the way school ought to be, but who should pay for these kids, because they're not their kids. And many of them are struggling with issues of retirement, Social Security, they're worried about crime, they're worried about health care. And yet, without the people of Iowa giving their permission to change the model, what you will do is just spin through superintendents. It goes all across America. The average tenure for a superintendent these days is 3 years. And it's not because they're all moving on, it's because they start to make moves and the community says no. So I believe we need to have a conversation between those inside the system and their allies like me and everybody else in the community. And the main goal of this conversation is to connect the dots between what schools need to do and what's in it for you. It's all very nice to say, oh, we have to change these, we have to get new schools, we have to get more technology because that's the right thing for the kids. And it is. But the fact of the matter is, people have to connect that need with their own quality of life. And it turns out, in the context of this conversation, we can show when you support your local public schools and student success increases, the crime rate in a community falls. When you support your schools, over the next 5 to 7 years, the tax base begins to rise. Because in the 21st century, businesses move towards places where there's highly developed human capital. When you support your local public schools, things you wouldn't even think about. Teen pregnancies decline when school success increases. The number of people using the emergency room as their primary care facility, and we all wind up paying for that. It's funneled into our premiums. All of that, almost every aspect of a person's quality of life, whether they have kids in school or not, is directly tied to the quality of the schools. And the purpose of the conversation is to make that case between those who want to see kids succeed and everybody else in the community.
Okay, and this kind of ties into the same thing. perception versus reality.
Right.
And most people have the perception that Des Moines Public Schools, being the largest provider of public education in the state, is just working daily on the challenges that face a large district. So the reality is, though, that we have the state's top advanced placement program. We have the only IB program in the state. So how can you fix that perception of folks?
Well, you and I both know that every now and then, perception becomes more important than reality. The fact of the matter is, referencing again the demographic trend, that we have this silver tsunami sweeping the state of Iowa. We're getting old. I'm getting old. My birthday's next week. Never thought I'd be 62. All of a sudden I am. And my priorities shift as I get older. Most people, because they have all these other interests, they're not really connected to the challenges that schools face. So part of the goal in the great conversation is to increase understanding of what's actually going on inside their schools, because they just don't know. The vast majority of them haven't stepped foot inside of a school since they graduated. That could be 5 decades ago. So the more we can tie in the facts, here's what's actually going on, and begin to build that, and frankly push back against the media that has a tendency to sensationalize all the negative, building this conversation one community at a time. Gradually what happens is the people begin to gravitate towards their schools, and with a greater understanding provide greater support.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Jamie.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. Don't forget, this and all other Classroom Connections episodes are available on our website. For Classroom Connections, I'm Sarah Taylor. Thanks for watching.